When the elderly man gave his answer, the entire studio fell into silence. Steve Harvey removed his jacket. Nobody in that Family Feud studio was prepared for what happened next. The cameras were rolling, the audience was laughing, the families were competing for points, and Steve Harvey was doing what he does best, making people smile. But then, in the middle of round 3, an elderly man with silver hair and trembling hands stepped up to the microphone. He held a small framed photograph close to his chest. And when he opened his mouth to answer the question on the board, everything changed. Steve stopped mid-gesture. His trademark grin faded. The audience's laughter died in their throats. And for the first time in decades of hosting, Steve Harvey did something that shocked every producer in the control room. He walked away from his mark, took off his suit jacket, and approached the elderly man not as a host, but as a human being. This is the story of how one answer on a game show became a moment that millions would never forget. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. It was a Thursday afternoon taping at the Family Feud studio in Atlanta. The energy was electric, the way it always is when Steve Harvey walks onto that stage. Two families stood at their podiums, the Martinez family from Texas and the Thompson family from Ohio. Both teams were tied going into the third round, the tension building with every buzz and every answer. The question flashed on the board. Name something that helps you get through the hardest days of your life. Standard Family Feud question. The kind Steve had asked 1,000 times before. The kind that usually gets answers like family, faith, music, friends. Safe answers. Predictable answers. Answers that make the audience nod and clap. The Martinez family buzzed in first. Family! The daughter shouted. Ding! Number 1 answer. 38 points. The crowd cheered. Steve moved down the line with his usual rhythm, microphone in hand, that signature smile lighting up the stage. The next contestant was Maria Martinez, a young mother in her 30s. Faith in God, she said confidently. Ding! Number 2. 24 points. More applause. Then came the elderly man. Robert Thompson. 76 years old. He had been quiet for most of the game, letting his children and grandchildren take the lead. He wore a simple cardigan sweater, the kind with worn elbows that suggested it had been a favorite for years. In his weathered hands, he clutched a small photograph in a silver frame. Steve noticed it immediately. In all his years of hosting, he had developed an instinct for reading people. And something about the way Robert held that photo, the way his fingers trembled slightly against the frame, told Steve that this man was carrying something heavy. All right, Robert, Steve said, his voice softening just a bit. What helps you get through the hardest days? Robert looked down at the photograph. For a moment, he said nothing. The studio waited. 5 seconds of silence on a game show feels like an eternity. The producers in the booth exchanged glances. Was he freezing? Did he need a moment? Then Robert lifted his eyes to Steve. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. My wife's voice, he said. Even though she's gone, I still hear her teaching me to believe again. The studio didn't just go quiet. It went still. As if every person in that room had been touched by something sacred. Steve Harvey stopped moving. His hand, which had been gesturing toward the board, dropped to his side. The smile that he wore like armor, the one that had carried him through thousands of episodes, faded completely. He stared at Robert, and for a moment, the game show host disappeared. In his place stood a man who understood grief. Say that again, Steve said softly, stepping closer. Robert's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away. My wife passed 2 years ago. Cancer. And in those last days, when I didn't think I could go on, she made me promise her something. She said, Robert, when I'm gone, you have to keep believing. Believe in love. Believe in family. Believe that life is still worth living. And every morning since she left, I wake up, and I hear her voice saying those words. That's what gets me through. The photograph he held was of her. A woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, frozen in a moment of joy that Robert could no longer share with her except in memory. Steve Harvey's eyes glistened. He glanced at the producer's booth, then at the audience, then back at Robert. And then he did something that broke every rule of television production. He removed his suit jacket. In the world of game shows, the host's wardrobe is sacred. It's part of the brand, the image, the consistency that viewers expect. Steve Harvey didn't just wear suits on Family Feud, he was known for them. Custom-tailored, perfectly pressed, a symbol of his success and professionalism. But in that moment, none of that mattered. Steve walked directly to Robert, draped the jacket over the elderly man's shoulders, and pulled him into an embrace. Not a quick, camera-friendly hug. A real one. The kind that says, "I see you. I feel your pain. And you are not alone." The audience rose to their feet. Some were crying. Others had their hands over their hearts. Even the opposing family, the Martinez team who had every reason to want Robert's answer to be wrong, were wiping their eyes. Steve pulled back, keeping his hands on Robert's shoulders. "Brother," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "your wife is proud of you. You hear me? She's proud." Robert nodded, unable to speak. Steve turned to the board. "Survey says..." Ding. "Memories of loved ones." Number 5 answer. 6 points. But the points didn't matter. Not anymore. Behind the scenes, something else was happening. The producers, who had been frantically signaling for Steve to move on, to get back to the game, slowly lowered their clipboards. The director, who had been ready to cut to commercial, kept the cameras rolling. Because they all knew they were witnessing something rare. This wasn't entertainment. This was communion. Steve didn't return to his mark. He stayed next to Robert, his hand on the man's back, as the game continued. When it was Robert's turn to answer again, Steve stood beside him like a guardian. And when the round ended, Steve didn't rush to the next segment. He let the moment breathe. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home ever saw coming. After the taping ended, after the families had taken their photos and the audience had filed out, Steve Harvey did something he had never done in over a decade of hosting Family Feud. He stayed. Usually, Steve would thank the crew, head to his dressing room, and move on to the next taping or the next commitment. His schedule was packed, his time precious. But that day, he walked over to Robert Thompson, who was gathering his things with his family, and he asked if they could talk. They sat in the empty studio, just the two of them, on the very stage where moments earlier hundreds of people had witnessed their exchange. Steve listened as Robert told him about his wife. About how they had met in college, how she had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself, how she had been his anchor through every storm. And how, in her final days, she had made him promise not to let grief consume him. "She made me write it down," Robert said, pulling a worn piece of paper from his wallet. "She made me promise I would read this every morning." Steve unfolded the paper. In shaky handwriting it read, "You are stronger than you know. You are loved beyond measure. And your story isn't over. Keep believing." Steve handed the paper back, his own eyes wet. "You know what?" he said. "I needed to hear that today too." They talked for over an hour. About faith. About loss. About the weight of carrying on when the person who made life meaningful is no longer there. And in that conversation, something shifted in Steve Harvey. Years later, in interviews, Steve would talk about that day. He would say that Robert Thompson reminded him why he did what he did. That underneath the laughs and the entertainment, there was something more important: connection. The reminder that every person who steps onto that stage is carrying a story. And some of those stories deserve more than a buzzer and a survey answer. Steve started a tradition after that day. Before every taping, he would take a moment to look at the families waiting to compete. Not as contestants, but as people. He would remind himself that some of them were there to escape their troubles, and some were there carrying burdens too heavy to name. And he made a promise to himself: if the moment called for it, he would stop being a host and start being a human. Robert Thompson's words. "My wife taught me to believe again. became something of a mantra for Steve. He had it written on a card that he kept in his dressing room. And whenever the grind of show business started to wear on him, whenever the lights and the cameras felt more like a burden than a blessing, he would read those words and remember. The jacket Steve gave to Robert that day? Robert kept it. He wore it to his granddaughter's wedding 6 months later. He wore it to church on Sundays. And when he passed away 3 years later, his family buried him in it. Because to Robert, that jacket wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a symbol. A reminder that in his darkest moment, a stranger had seen him, had honored his love, had told him he mattered. Steve Harvey never asked for the jacket back. When Robert's family reached out to return it after his passing, Steve told them to keep it. "That jacket belongs to your family now," he said. "It's part of his story. And his story is beautiful." The episode aired months later. The producers had debated whether to include the moment, whether it fit the tone of a game show. But when they watched the footage, they knew they had no choice. This was bigger than Family Feud. This was a testament to what television could be when it stopped trying to be perfect and started trying to be real. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from viewers who had lost spouses, parents, children. People who had been going through their own valleys of grief and who found comfort in seeing Steve Harvey honor Robert Thompson's pain. The clip went viral, racking up millions of views, shared across every platform with captions like, "This is why we love Steve Harvey," and "Faith in humanity restored." But for Steve, the impact was personal. He began using his platform differently. He started sharing his own stories of loss and struggle more openly. He created moments on his other shows, like his talk show, where he would pause the entertainment to simply sit with someone in their pain. He became known not just as a comedian or a host, but as a man who wasn't afraid to be vulnerable. And it all traced back to that Thursday afternoon. To an elderly man with a photograph. To a question about getting through hard days. To a moment when the script was thrown out and humanity took over. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Robert Thompson taught Steve Harvey something that day, even though he probably didn't realize it. He taught him that belief isn't about never doubting. It's about choosing to get up every morning even when the person who made mornings worth waking up for is gone. It's about carrying love forward, even when the one you love is no longer there to receive it. And Steve Harvey, in turn, taught millions of viewers something just as important. That kindness doesn't have to wait for the right moment. That compassion doesn't need permission. That sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is take off your armor and be present with someone in their pain. The legacy of that moment continues. Steve Harvey still hosts Family Feud. He still makes people laugh, still reacts to wild answers with that iconic expression of disbelief. But now, there's something else there too. A depth. A readiness to meet people where they are. Not just where the show needs them to be. And somewhere, in the quiet moments between tapings, Steve thinks about Robert. About the man who stood on his stage and reminded everyone watching that love doesn't end when life does. That the people we lose teach us how to keep living. That belief, real belief, is built not in the easy moments but in the hard ones. The jacket is gone now, resting with Robert. But what it represented, what that moment created lives on. In every episode where Steve pauses to really listen. In every time he chooses connection over comedy. In every viewer who watches and thinks, maybe I can believe again too. Because that's the power of one honest moment. One elderly man. One photograph. One promise made to a dying wife. And one game show host who was willing to stop the show and simply be human. That day, Robert Thompson didn't just answer a question on Family Feud. He reminded us all that love never dies, it just changes form. And Steve Harvey didn't just host a game show. He showed us what it means to truly see another person's pain and honor it. Some moments are bigger than television. This was one of them.